how standard really is the international standard cartridge system? I have some admittedly cheap pens that are supposed to take international cartridges that a cartridge will not stay put in it. For example, they easily fall out. I have similar results with converters for them. Yes, so the standard international converter cartridge system is pretty standard, or at least it should be. So there are some brands that it kind of looks, the cartridge looks like a standard international, but it's not exactly the same. That kind of situation you run into could just be, it is actually a proprietary one, especially for a cheaper pen, and they're just not bothering to really tell you or help you out in that way. Usually though, it's standard international because the components that they make for these pens are made en masse by, you know, a couple of different companies around the world, and they sell the parts out to whatever pen company is manufacturing it, and they design it around those parts. And because the feed and all that stuff, the nib and all that, is the most difficult part to design in a pen. So usually you'll have some kind of feed system with the filling mechanism, and then you'll design a pen around that if you're a pen designer of sorts. So especially with an inexpensive pen, you're gonna go off a standard international more likely than not. You know, think about specifically like a Jinhao type company. You're going to run into you know, something where, okay, there might be a kind of a non-standard version of the converter that they include or something like that, but it's still standard international. It'll fit standard international stuff on there. You may get into some kind of off-brands and, you know, really inexpensive stuff that the QC is just not fantastic. So you might run into things where it's supposed to fit a standard international, but it just doesn't. And I haven't heard of that happening a lot, but it's certainly a possibility. And if that's the case, you know, return the pen if it's worthwhile, or just use whatever cartridge that it came with and just refill it until you can't use it anymore, you know, or toss it, or, you know. The only other thing that I could think is like, okay, if I had a pen, I had no cartridge, no converter of any kind that would fit and stay in the pen. In this type of situation, I would just eyedropper convert it. If it's got metal components to it, if the body is sealed up and it's got metal components to it, and if the alternative was throwing the pen out, I would just eyedropper convert it. And yes, eventually the metal is gonna, you know, corrode away based on the ink contact and stuff like that. But if your alternative is throwing the pen out, what do you really have to lose at that point? You know, there's no use worrying about damaging the pen if the alternative is the trash. The only other thing that I would say about, you know, that pen is, sometimes with less expensive pens, the tolerances can be just a little bit off. I have a Daiso pen here, and you know, their cartridges in here, they're standard international. They look a little different, but it's the same end on it. Sometimes what you run into with some of the less expensive pens is, you know, the tolerances are not quite as exact. So it'll be a standard international, but it won't quite be exactly the same size as you're dealing with something else. Not drastic enough to where it's unusable, but just enough to where it won't quite fit the same with the same force that maybe you're used to on some of your other standard internationals. So especially in your situation where you're talking about, you know, it's not fitting in, it's fitting in too loosely. So that's where I would say you want to make sure that you've pressed it in all the way. And I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, like if it's too loose, how's pressing it in going to help? Well, what happens sometimes is you run into, there's like a step in here, or there's a specific like part of it that kind of hangs up a little bit. And so you feel like you've put it in and installed it properly, but in fact it's just kind of hanging loosely in there and then it falls out. You need to make sure that you are really connecting in there. And sometimes you might even hear a little click when you do it. Make sure that you're going for that. And if it's like, if you're really mashing it in there and you get at the point where you're like damaging the cartridge because you're pushing it so hard, then you're probably, yeah, it's probably just not fitting. The tolerance is maybe too thin and it's not actually fitting properly, and then you don't really have as much a choice there. But if it's the problem is tolerance is too thick, I guess would be the way to describe it, you need to press harder to make sure that it's actually connecting in there. You'd be surprised how many times that I hear as that being the issue with pens when people think that it's not fitting properly. It's just that they need to press harder in there. So check out for those things and see if that helps you at all.